Hi, I'm Riley, and 6 months ago, my own parents threw my belongings onto their front lawn and screamed at me to never darken their doorstep again. All because I lost my job at a tech startup that went under overnight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the twist they never saw coming. I was the one secretly paying their mortgage for the past 3 years. And when that foreclosure notice landed in their mailbox last Tuesday, guess whose number they called first? Sometimes the people who are supposed to catch you when you fall are the same ones who push you off the cliff. But maybe that's exactly what you need to finally learn how to fly. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world crumbled, not with a bang, but with a Microsoft Teams notification that popped up at exactly 9:47 a.m. All hands meeting in 5 minutes. Mandatory attendance. The kind of message that makes your stomach drop before your brain even processes why. I was sitting in my home office in my Capitol Hill apartment, still in my pajama bottoms and an oversized University of Colorado sweatshirt, nursing my second cup of coffee while debugging a user interface that had been giving me headaches for weeks. The Denver skyline stretched out beyond my window, the morning sun casting long shadows across the city that had become my home after college. InnovateTech Solutions had been my dream job for 2.5 years. A scrappy startup focused on accessibility software for small businesses, the kind of company where everyone knew everyone's coffee order, and we celebrated wins with impromptu happy hours at the brewery down the street. I'd started as a junior UX designer fresh out of college and worked my way up to senior developer, pouring my heart into projects that actually mattered. The Zoom call lasted exactly 12 minutes. CEO Jonathan Miller, usually the type of guy who wore jeans to board meetings and remembered your birthday, looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His voice cracked slightly as he explained the funding had fallen through. Their primary investor had pulled out without warning, citing market instability and shifting priorities. Effective immediately, all operations would cease. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said, his face pixelated from a poor internet connection that somehow made the whole thing feel even more surreal. You're all incredibly talented people, and I know you'll land on your feet. We'll provide references, and HR will be in touch about final paychecks and COBRA information. Just like that, the screen went black. No goodbye hugs, no cleaning, out desks together, no final team lunch. Just silence, and the sudden realization that the direct deposit I'd been counting on wouldn't be coming in 2 weeks. I sat in my desk chair for a long time after that, staring at my reflection in the dark monitor. The woman looking back at me had shoulder-length brown hair that needed a trim, tired green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a expression I'd never seen before. It took me a moment to recognize it as genuine fear. The first person I called was Chloe, my best friend since our sophomore year dorm days. She picked up on the first ring, probably because she was between client calls at her marketing firm downtown. "Riley, aren't you supposed to be in some important meeting right now?" "I just got laid off," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "The whole company folded. Everyone's gone." There was a pause. Then Chloe's voice went soft in that way it did when she was switching into protective mode. "Oh, honey, are you okay? Do you want me to come over? I can leave work." "I'm fine," I lied, then immediately corrected myself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. But I don't need you to leave work. I just needed to tell someone who wouldn't immediately ask me what my backup plan was." "Well, what is your backup plan?" she asked gently, and despite everything, I found myself laughing. "I have about 4 months of expenses saved up, maybe 5 if I eat a lot of ramen. I'll start applying to jobs today. The market's decent for developers, especially with my experience. I'll be fine." But even as I said it, my mind was already calculating. Rent, utilities, groceries, car payment, student loans. And then there was the other payment, the one I'd never told Chloe about. The one I'd been making faithfully for 3 years without my parents ever knowing where the extra money came from. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and stared at the banking app. On my screen, every month for 36 months, I'd transferred $2,400 to my parents' account. Not a loan, not a temporary fix, but a lifeline they didn't even know existed. It had started when my dad's landscaping business hit a rough patch and they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. They'd mentioned it casually during a family dinner, the way people do when they're trying to sound unconcerned about something that's actually terrifying them. The housing market's just in a weird place right now, my mom Barbara had said, stirring her coffee with more force than necessary. Frank's got some big contracts coming up in the spring. We'll catch up then. But I'd seen the stress lines around my dad's eyes, the way he'd started checking his phone obsessively during meals. I'd also seen the foreclosure notice that had been accidentally left on their kitchen counter during my last visit, hastily covered with a magazine when they realized I'd noticed it. So I'd done what I always did when my family was in trouble. I fixed it quietly. I called their mortgage company, pretended to be Barbara Thompson, and set up an automatic payment from my account. I told myself it was temporary, just until Dad's business picked up. That was 3 years ago. The payment was set to go through in 5 days. I closed the banking app and opened Indeed instead. Senior UX developer positions, software engineer roles, anything that might provide steady income and health insurance. I spent the next 4 hours crafting cover letters and updating my portfolio, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. By evening, I'd applied to 12 positions and reached out to 5 former colleagues who'd moved on to other companies. I treated myself to Thai takeout from the place around the corner and settled in to binge-watch something mindless on Netflix. Tomorrow, I'd tell my parents about the job loss. Tonight, I just wanted to pretend everything was normal for a few more hours. My phone rang at 7:30 p.m. Marcus, my older brother, his contact photo showing him in his police uniform with that serious expression he'd worn since joining the Denver PD 5 years ago. "Hey, Riley, you got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "Mom called me earlier. She's worried about you." I paused the TV, confused. "Worried about me? Why?" "She said you seemed distracted during your last visit. Quote unquote, not yourself. You know how she gets when she thinks one of us is keeping secrets." I almost laughed at the irony. If Mom only knew the size of the secret I'd been keeping. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just work stuff. You know how it is." "Actually, I don't. You never talk about work problems. Usually you're telling us about some new project you're excited about or some team-building thing your hipster startup did." He wasn't wrong. I'd always been the optimistic one in the family, the one who saw silver linings and turned setbacks into opportunities. It was my role, as established and unchanging as Marcus being the responsible protector, and our parents being the ones who worried about money but never quite managed to get ahead of it. "Things are just stressful right now," I said. "But it's nothing I can't handle." "Riley." His voice took on that big brother tone, the one that meant he wasn't buying what I was selling. "What's really going on?" I could have told him then. Could have explained about the layoff, about the automatic payment that was going to bounce in 5 days, about the 3 years of financial help our parents didn't know they'd been receiving. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the fear that once I said it out loud, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for. "I lost my job today," I said finally. "The whole company shut down. But I have savings and I'm already applying to new places. I'll be fine." There was silence on the other end, then Marcus let out a low whistle. "Shit, Riley. I'm sorry. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" "I'm okay, really. I just need some time to figure out next steps." "Have you told Mom and Dad?" "Not yet. I will tomorrow." "Want me to be there when you do? You know how Dad gets about job security." That was an understatement. Frank Thompson had worked for the same landscaping company for 15 years before starting his own business, and even then it was only because his boss retired and basically handed him the client list. The idea of voluntary job changes, let alone involuntary ones, made him physically uncomfortable. "Thanks, but I'll handle it. It's not that big a deal." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Losing my job wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the mortgage payment that wouldn't go through, about the delicate financial balance I'd been maintaining without anyone's knowledge, about the fact that my parents' home might be at risk and they didn't even know it. After Marcus and I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and tried to figure out what came next. The responsible thing would be to tell my parents immediately, to explain about the automatic payment and help them figure out alternative arrangements. But I also knew my parents, knew how they'd react to the news that their youngest daughter had been secretly covering their mortgage for 3 years. Dad would be humiliated. Mom would be angry, the kind of angry that came from feeling pitied by your own child. They'd both insist they never asked for help, that they would have figured something else out, that they didn't need charity from their kids. Except they did need it. They had needed it for 3 years, and they were going to need it even more now that I couldn't provide it. I opened my laptop again and looked at job postings until my eyes burned. The market was decent, but decent didn't mean I'd have an offer by next week. Even in the best-case scenario, it would be weeks before I had a new job, and probably at least a month before I saw a paycheck. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I'd drive out to Lakewood to see my parents, break the news about the job, loss gently, and then figure out how to handle the mortgage situation. Maybe I could take out a personal loan to cover the next few months while I job searched. Maybe Dad's business had actually improved, and they could take over the payments without too much strain. I dressed carefully for the visit, choosing a nice sweater and jeans that didn't look too expensive. Image management had become second nature when dealing with my parents, a careful balance between looking successful enough that they didn't worry about me and not so successful that they felt inadequate by comparison. The drive from Capitol Hill to Lakewood took 30 minutes in mid-morning traffic, winding through neighborhoods that got progressively more suburban and manicured. My parents lived in a development called Sunset Ridge, where every house had a 2-car garage and a small front yard maintained by the HOA landscaping crew. It was the kind of neighborhood they'd dreamed of when I was growing up in our cramped apartment near downtown. They'd bought the house in 2018, right before the market started getting crazy. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Dad had been so proud the day they got the keys, walking me and Marcus through every room like he was giving a tour of the White House. "Can you believe this is ours?" he'd said, running his hand along the kitchen island. "Your mom and I? We never thought we'd have something like this." That pride was part of what made the mortgage situation so complicated. This house wasn't just shelter for my parents. It was proof that they'd made it, that all the years of struggling and scraping had led somewhere worthwhile. I pulled into their driveway next to Dad's work truck, noting that the flower beds looked particularly well-maintained. Business must be doing okay, I thought, feeling a small spark of hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mom answered the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching for me through the front window. "Riley, what a nice surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." Barbara Thompson was one of those women who'd been beautiful in high school and had figured out how to age gracefully into elegant. At 52, she kept her blonde hair in a neat bob, wore makeup even for grocery store runs, and always looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog for suburban mothers. She was also one of the most anxious people I'd ever known, a trait that had only gotten worse as she'd gotten older. "Hi, Mom. Is Dad around? I wanted to talk to you both about something." Her smile flickered slightly. "Is everything okay? You look tired." "I'm fine. Is Dad here?" "He's in the garage organizing his tools. You know how he gets when business slows down in the fall." She led me through the house, past the living room with its carefully arranged throw pillows and the dining room they only used for holidays. "Frank! Riley's here!" Dad emerged from the garage wiping his hands on a rag, his graying hair sticking up at odd angles. Frank Thompson was a big man, not tall but broad, with hands that were permanently stained from years of working with soil and mulch. He'd been handsome once too, in a rugged working man way, but the stress of running his own business had carved deep lines around his eyes. "Hey, kiddo," he said, giving me a hug that smelled like WD-40 and coffee. "What brings you by on a Wednesday?" "I wanted to talk to you both about something. Can we sit down?" They exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that came from 25 years of marriage. We settled in the living room, me on the couch and them in matching recliners that they'd bought on sale at Ashley Furniture. "So," I began, trying to sound casual, "I have some news. It's not bad news exactly, but it's definitely news." Mom leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. Dad just waited, patient in the way that came from years of dealing with clients who took forever to explain what they wanted. "I lost my job yesterday. The company shut down completely. Everyone got laid off." The silence that followed was heavy and familiar. It was the same silence that had filled our old apartment whenever the electricity got shut off, or the car broke down, or any of the dozen other financial crises that had punctuated my childhood. Dad was the first to speak. "How did this happen? I thought that computer company of yours was doing well." "It was, but our main investor pulled out unexpectedly. These things happen with startups. It's not uncommon." "Not uncommon?" Mom's voice went up an octave. "Riley, you can't just lose your job and act like it's no big deal. What are you going to do for money? What about your health insurance?" "I have some savings and I'm already applying to new positions. The job market for developers is pretty good right now. I'll probably have something lined up within a few weeks." "Probably," Dad repeated. "Riley, probably doesn't pay rent." This was going about as well as I'd expected. In the Thompson family worldview, financial security was the only thing that mattered, because they'd spent so many years without it. The idea of voluntary career risks, of choosing passion over stability, was completely foreign to them. "I know you're worried," I said, "but I've been through this before. Remember when I graduated college and it took me 3 months to find my first job? I managed fine then and I'll manage fine now." "That was different," Mom said. "You were 22 and living with us. Now you have real responsibilities." I almost asked what she thought those responsibilities were, but stopped myself. They didn't know about the mortgage payments, didn't know that their financial stability had been tied to my job for the past 3 years. To them, I was just their youngest daughter who worked with computers and lived in an expensive apartment downtown. "I'll be fine," I repeated. "I just wanted to let you know what was happening." Dad stood up and started pacing, which was never a good sign. "This is what happens when you work for these fly-by-night companies. You should have gotten a job with the state or the school district. Something stable." "Frank," Mom said quietly, but he was just getting started. "I told you when you took that job that startups were risky. But no, you had to work for the trendy company with the ping-pong tables and the free snacks." "Well, where are your ping-pong tables now?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Dad, it wasn't about ping-pong tables. I loved the work I was doing. We were building software that actually helped people. And how's that helping you now that you're unemployed?" The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering all the familiar ground of our disagreements about my career choices. Dad thought I was irresponsible for working at a startup. Mom thought I should move back home to save money. I tried to explain that software development wasn't like landscaping, that the industry worked differently, that career mobility often meant taking calculated risks. What I didn't tell them was that in 5 days, their mortgage payment would bounce. That their perfect house in their perfect neighborhood was only theirs because their irresponsible startup working daughter had been covering the payments they couldn't afford. I left an hour later with promises to keep them updated on my job search and a container of leftover pot roast that Mom insisted I take. As I drove back toward the city, I kept thinking about the expression on Dad's face when he'd talked about my real responsibilities. If only he knew. The call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Monday morning, exactly 5 days after I'd told my parents about losing my job. I was deep in the kind of sleep that only comes from exhaustion, having stayed up until 2 a.m. applying to jobs and tweaking my resume for the 100th time. The sharp buzz of my phone cut through my dreams like a fire alarm. Riley. Dad's voice was different, strained in a way I'd never heard before. Not angry exactly, but something worse. Confused. Betrayed. I sat up in bed, immediately alert despite the early hour. "Dad? What's wrong? We need to talk. Now. Can you come over?" My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what this was about. The mortgage payment had bounced, and they'd called the bank to figure out why. "Dad, I can explain." "No." He cut me off, his voice sharp enough to make me flinch. "No explanations over the phone. You get in your car and you come here right now. Your mother and I are waiting." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, watching the call timer reset to 0. Outside my bedroom window, Denver was still mostly dark, the sun just beginning to hint at the horizon. I'd known this moment would come eventually, but I'd hoped to have more time, hoped to have a new job lined up so I could frame the conversation differently. Instead, I was about to walk into what felt like an ambush with nothing but 3 years of good intentions and an empty bank account. I threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, not bothering with makeup or breakfast. The drive to Lakewood felt both endless and too short, my mind cycling through possible ways to explain what I'd done. Every version sounded either condescending or pathetic. There was no way to say, "I've been secretly paying your mortgage for 3 years," without implying that they couldn't handle their own finances. The problem was, they couldn't. And now they were about to find out that I couldn't either. I pulled into their driveway at 7:15 a.m. Dad's truck was there, but there was also a silver sedan I didn't recognize parked on the street. Through the front window, I could see figures moving around in the living room. This was going to be worse than I'd imagined. Mom opened the door before I could knock, and I immediately knew we were in crisis mode. She was still in her bathrobe, her usually perfect hair uncombed, her face pale and tight with stress. Behind her, I could see Dad pacing, in the living room, still in yesterday's clothes. "Riley." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Come in." I followed her into the living room, where I discovered the source of the silver sedan. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the couch, still in his police uniform from the night shift, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Next, to him sat a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged with short gray hair and a tired expression. "This is Janet from the bank," Mom said, gesturing to the woman. "She came by this morning to discuss our situation." Janet stood up and extended her hand. "Ms. Thompson, I'm Janet Morrison, the mortgage specialist at First National. I was just explaining to your parents about the automatic payment that's been coming from your account." I shook her hand, my mouth suddenly dry. "I see." "Riley." Dad's voice cut across the room like a blade. "Sit down." I perched on the edge of the armchair, the same one I'd sat in 5 days ago when I'd told them about losing my job. The same chair where I'd kept my mouth shut about the mortgage payments, thinking I could figure out a solution before they found out. Dad stopped pacing and turned to face me, his arms crossed over his chest. "Janet here tells us that for the past 3 years, someone has been making our mortgage payments from an external account. Every month, like clockwork. $2,400. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "And this morning, when that payment bounced, the bank called us to see if we wanted to make alternative arrangements." His voice was getting louder, with each word. "Imagine our surprise when we learned that our mortgage was being paid by someone we didn't even know about." Frank? Mom said quietly, but he held up a hand. No, Barbara. Let me finish. He turned back to me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but genuine hurt. Janet was very helpful in explaining the situation. She told us that the payments started in November 2020, right around the time we were having trouble making ends meet, right around the time our business was struggling. The room was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Mom had inherited from her mother. I could feel everyone watching me, waiting for me to say something, anything, to explain why I'd done what I'd done. I was trying to help, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Help? Dad's voice cracked. You call lying to us? For 3 years helping? I wasn't lying. What would you call it then? Mom spoke for the first time since letting me in, her voice shaking. What would you call secretly paying our bills without telling us? I looked around the room, at Marcus staring at his hands, at Janet looking like she wished she could disappear, at my parents waiting for an answer I didn't have. I saw the foreclosure notice, I said. 3 years ago, when I came over for dinner. It was on the kitchen counter, and I could see how scared you both were. I knew Dad's business was struggling, and I knew you were too proud to ask for help, so I fixed it. You fixed it, Dad repeated slowly. Like we were a problem that needed solving. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. He started pacing again, his hands clenched into fists. You saw your poor, pathetic parents who couldn't manage their own finances, and you decided to swoop in and save us, without even having the courtesy to tell us what you were doing. It wasn't like that, I protested. But even as I said it, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. I had seen them as a problem to solve, a crisis to manage. It had never occurred to me that the solution might be worse than the problem. Marcus finally looked up. Riley, how could you afford $2,400 a month? That's more than I make in take-home pay. I was making good money at the startup, I said, and I live pretty simply. It wasn't a big deal. Wasn't a big deal? Mom's voice went up an octave. Riley, you've been paying our mortgage for 3 years. That's almost $90,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. I'd never actually calculated the total before, had never wanted to think about it that way. Hearing it out loud made my chest tight. Where did you think the money was coming from? I asked, genuinely curious despite everything. Did you ever wonder why the payments were suddenly getting made on time every month? Dad and Mom exchanged a look, and I saw the truth in their faces. They had known something was off. They'd just chosen not to examine it too closely. We thought maybe the bank had made some kind of error in our favor, Mom said quietly. Or that maybe Frank's automatic payment had finally started working properly. For 3 years? Marcus asked incredulously. We didn't want to ask too many questions, Dad admitted. And for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked less angry and more ashamed. Business was tough, and the payments were getting made, and we were grateful for whatever cosmic mistake was keeping us in our house. Janet cleared her throat delicately. If I may interrupt, we do need to discuss what happens next. The account that's been making the payments is now insufficient, and you're currently 30 days past due on your mortgage. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I could see the panic starting to creep back into my parents' faces, the same look they'd worn 3 years ago when they'd first gotten behind on the payments. What are our options? Dad asked. Janet opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Well, you can bring the account current by paying the missed payment plus late fees, which would be approximately $2,600. After that, you'd need to resume making regular monthly payments of $2,400. We don't have $2,600, Mom said flatly. If we had that kind of money, we wouldn't have gotten behind in the first place. I understand. In that case, we can discuss a loan modification, though I should warn you that those can be difficult to qualify for. Or, she paused, looking uncomfortable. There's also the option of selling the home before the foreclosure process begins. The word foreclosure hit the room like a physical blow. Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Dad's face went gray. How long do we have? He asked. If you can't bring the account current within 60 days, we'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings. After that, it's typically another 4 to 6 months before the house would actually be sold at auction. I found my voice again. I can cover this month's payment, I said. I still have some savings left. No. Dad's voice was like a steel door slamming shut. Absolutely not. Dad, please, let me help. Help? He whirled around to face me, and I saw that the hurt in his eyes had transformed into something much harder. You want to help? You've helped enough, Riley. 3 years of help, and look where it's gotten us. You would have lost the house 3 years ago if I hadn't helped, I said, my own anger finally flaring. At least this way you got 3 more years in your dream home. Our dream home that we never actually earned, Mom said quietly. Our dream home that we've been living in under false pretenses. That's not true, isn't it? Dad's voice was getting louder again. Every month for 3 years we've been living a lie. Every time someone complimented us on the house, every time we hosted a family gathering, every time we felt proud of what we'd accomplished, it was all based on your charity. The word charity felt like a slap. It wasn't charity. You're my parents. I love you. If you loved us, you would have respected us enough to tell us what you were doing, Mom said, tears finally starting to fall. If you loved us, you wouldn't have let us live in a fantasy. Marcus stood up abruptly. Okay, this is getting out of hand. Everyone needs to calm down and figure out what we're going to do next. What we're going to do, Dad said, his voice deadly calm, is handle our own problems from now on, without any more help from our daughter who thinks we're too stupid to manage our own lives. I never said you were stupid. You didn't have to say it. Your actions said it loud and clear. Janet stood up, gathering her papers. I think I should go and let you all discuss this privately. Here's my card, and these are the documents outlining your options. Please call me by Friday with your decision. She shook hands with my parents and nodded politely to me and Marcus before letting herself out. The silence after the front door closed was deafening. Riley, Marcus said carefully, why don't you explain what your financial situation is right now? Maybe we can figure out a solution together. I took a shaky breath. I have about $8,000 left in savings. Maybe enough to cover 2 more mortgage payments, but then I'd be completely tapped out, and I still don't have a job. So even if we let you continue your little charity project, Dad said bitterly, it would only buy us 2 more months. I'm going to find another job. Are you? Mom asked. Because from what you told us last week, finding a job could take months. And even if you do find one, what makes you think it'll pay enough for you to support yourself and us? She wasn't wrong. The tech job market was competitive, and even if I found something quickly, it might not pay as much as my previous position. The startup world was volatile in both directions. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I know I should have told you what I was doing. I know it was wrong to keep it secret. But the alternative 3 years ago was losing the house. At least this way, we have time to figure something out. Time built on lies, Dad said. Time built on love, I shot back. I saw you struggling and I helped. That's what families do. Families communicate, Mom said. Families don't make major financial decisions in secret. Families don't treat each other like children who can't handle the truth. You want the truth? My voice was getting louder now, 3 years of frustration finally boiling over. The truth is that you've been living beyond your means for years. The truth is that Dad's business has never been as successful as you pretend it is. The truth is that you bought a house you couldn't afford because you wanted to keep up with your neighbors, and when reality hit, you were too proud to downsize or ask for help. The silence that followed was arctic. Dad's face went through several different emotions before settling on cold fury. "Get out," he said quietly. "Dad, get out of our house." His voice was still quiet, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "Get out and don't come back." "Frank," Mom said, but he held up a hand. "No, Barbara, I'm done. I'm done being pitied by my own daughter. I'm done being treated like a charity case. We'll figure this out ourselves, the way we should have been doing all along." Marcus stood up. "Dad, maybe everyone should just take a step back. You too, Marcus. If you knew about this, you can get out too." "I didn't know," Marcus said quickly. "I had no idea Riley was doing this." Dad looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine. But Riley, I want you out. Now." I looked at my mother, hoping for some kind of support, some indication that she disagreed with Dad's ultimatum. But she was staring at her hands, tears dripping onto her bathrobe. "Mom?" I said quietly. She looked up and I saw something in her face that broke my heart. Not just anger or disappointment, but genuine embarrassment. She was ashamed, not just of the financial situation, but of me, of what I'd done, of what I'd seen, of what I knew about their struggles. "I think you should go," she said softly. "We need some time to process all of this." I stood up on shaking legs. "So that's it? 3 years of helping you, and you're just going to throw me out?" "3 years of lying to us," Dad corrected. 3 years of treating us like we were incompetent. "I was trying to help," I repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Well, congratulations," Dad said. "You've helped us right into foreclosure." I wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they'd been headed for foreclosure 3 years ago, too, that I'd only delayed the inevitable while giving them time to get their finances in order. But looking at their faces, I realized it didn't matter. The math didn't matter. The good intentions didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd made a decision that affected their lives without including them in it, and that was unforgivable. I walked to the front door, Marcus following behind me. "Riley?" he said quietly as I reached for the handle. "Give them some time. They're upset right now, but they'll calm down." I turned to look back at the living room, where my parents sat in their matching recliners like 2 judges who'd just delivered a verdict. The house around them was beautiful, decorated with care and pride, a symbol of everything they'd worked for and dreamed of. In 2 months, maybe less, it would belong to the bank. "Take care of them," I said to Marcus, then opened the door and walked out into the morning light. As I drove away, I could see Dad in my rearview mirror, standing in the doorway watching me leave. He stayed there until I turned the corner and disappeared from view, and I couldn't tell if he was making sure I was really gone or hoping I might change my mind and come back. Either way, it didn't matter. The bridge was burned, the secret was out, and my family was about to lose their home. And somehow, despite everything I'd tried to do to prevent it, it was all my fault. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of rejection emails and sleepless nights. I'd applied to 47 positions, had 12 phone screenings, and made it to final interviews for 3 jobs that ultimately went to other candidates. The tech market, it turned out, wasn't as robust as I'd hoped. Companies were being more selective, taking longer to make decisions, and everyone wanted someone who was currently employed. I was living off ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, having burned through most of my remaining savings on rent and basic utilities. My Capitol Hill apartment, which had once felt like a symbol of my independence and success, now felt like an expensive prison. Every morning I woke up to the same routine: check email for job responses, apply to new positions, try not to think about the fact that my parents were probably going through foreclosure proceedings while refusing to speak to me. Marcus called every few days with updates that made my stomach hurt. Mom had stopped sleeping, spending her nights researching loan modification programs and bankruptcy laws. Dad had thrown himself into work with manic intensity, taking on landscaping, jobs that barely covered his business expenses, let alone the mortgage. They'd contacted 3 different lawyers about their options, but everyone told them the same thing. Without a significant change in income or a lump sum to bring the account current, foreclosure was inevitable. "They're stubborn as hell," Marcus told me during one of our conversations. He was calling from his patrol car during a break, and I could hear radio chatter in the background. Mom found some program for people facing foreclosure, but it requires them to prove financial hardship, and Dad refuses to admit they can't afford the house. "What about selling it before the foreclosure goes through?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They owe more than it's worth in this market. Even if they could find a buyer quickly, they'd have to bring money to closing just to get out from under it." I sat in my living room, looking out at the Denver skyline and feeling completely helpless. For 3 years, I'd been the solution to my parents' problems. Now I was unemployed, nearly broke, and banned from even trying to help. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion while being tied to a chair. The worst part was the silence. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that I existed. I'd sent a few careful messages to my mom, asking how they were doing, offering to talk things through, but she never responded. It was like I'd been erased from their lives as completely as if I'd never been born. On a Thursday afternoon in early November, I was in the middle of a phone interview with a startup in Boulder when my doorbell rang. I ignored it, staying focused on explaining my experience with user interface design to someone who sounded like they were barely old enough to drive. But the ringing was persistent, turning into rhythmic knocking that was impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry," I said to the interviewer. "Could you hold on just one moment? Someone's at my door." I muted the call and hurried to the window, expecting to see a delivery driver or maybe one of my neighbors. Instead, I saw a familiar silver Honda Civic parked at the curb, and my heart stopped. Chloe was standing on my doorstep, but she wasn't alone. Next to her was a woman I'd never seen before, middle-aged with dark curly hair and a professional-looking briefcase. Behind them, leaning against Chloe's car, was someone I definitely hadn't expected to see. Uncle Steve, my mom's older brother, was checking his phone with the patient expression of someone who'd been waiting for a while. He looked up and saw me in the window, giving me a small wave that was somehow both casual and significant. I held up one finger to indicate I needed a minute, then went back to my phone interview. "I'm so sorry about that interruption. Could we possibly reschedule this call? Something urgent has come up." The interviewer, probably used to dealing with candidates who had their lives in chaos, agreed to call back the next day. I hung up and opened the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Uncle Steve lived in Colorado Springs, about an hour south of Denver. He wouldn't drive up here, without a good reason. "Riley," Chloe said, giving me a hug that felt like she was trying to hold me together. "We need to talk." "Hi, Uncle Steve," I said, still trying to process his presence. "This is unexpected." Steve Thompson was one of those men who seemed to get more distinguished with age. At 58, he had silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of calm demeanor that came from years of managing other people's crises. He worked as a financial advisor, helping people plan for retirement and navigate major life changes. He was also the only person in my extended family who'd never seemed intimidated by my parents' pride. "Hey, kiddo," he said, stepping forward to give me a quick hug. "I know this is out of the blue, but we need to have a conversation. This is Patricia Hughes. She's a real estate attorney who specializes in foreclosure prevention." Patricia stepped forward with a professional smile and a firm handshake. "Ms. Thompson, I've been working with your uncle to review your family's situation. I hope you don't mind that he shared some details with me, but I think I might be able to help. I looked between the three of them, feeling like I'd walked into a meeting that had been planned without my knowledge. How do you even know about the situation? Marcus called me, Steve said simply. He was worried about Frank. And Barbara, but he was also worried about you. He thought maybe an outside perspective might help. Come on, Chloe said, taking my arm. Let's go inside and sit down. Patricia has some interesting information. We settled in my living room, which suddenly felt too small for 4 people and the weight of whatever conversation we were about to have. Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, the kind that usually contained either very good news or very bad news. Before we begin, she said, I want to make sure you understand that everything we discuss is confidential. I represent you in this conversation, not your parents. Though my hope is that we can find a solution that benefits everyone. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what kind of solution could possibly exist. My parents weren't speaking to me. They were facing foreclosure, and I was unemployed with about $3,000 to my name. Steve has filled me in on the basic situation, Patricia continued. You've been making mortgage payments on your parents' home for 3 years. They recently discovered this arrangement when your payment bounced, and they've asked you not to contact them while they try to resolve the foreclosure on their own. That's a pretty accurate summary, I said. What you might not realize is that your 3 years of payments have created some interesting legal implications. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them across my coffee table like she was dealing cards. When someone makes regular payments on a mortgage they don't legally owe, especially over an extended period, it can establish what's called beneficial interest in the property. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of the legal language. What does that mean in English? It means you might have a legal claim to partial ownership of the house, Steve said. Not enough to force a sale or anything dramatic, but enough to have a say in what happens to it. My head was spinning. I don't want to own my parents' house. I never wanted anything except to help them keep it. I understand, Patricia said. But the law doesn't always care about our intentions. What matters is that you made nearly $90,000 in payments on a property you don't live in and don't legally own. That creates certain rights. Chloe leaned forward. Riley, just listen to what she's proposing. Patricia pulled out another document, this one looking more like a contract. What I'm suggesting is that we use your legal position to negotiate a solution that works for everyone. Your parents can't afford the mortgage payments, and you can't afford to resume making them even if you find a new job. But there might be a third option. Which is? We approach the bank about a deed in lieu of foreclosure, with you as the primary negotiator. Essentially, your parents would voluntarily transfer ownership of the house to you, and you would negotiate with the bank to settle the debt for less than the full amount owed. I felt like I was trying to solve a math problem in a foreign language, but I don't have money to buy the house from the bank. You wouldn't be buying it, Steve explained. You'd be negotiating a settlement. Banks don't want to own houses. They want to recover as much of their loan as possible with minimum hassle. If you can offer them a lump sum settlement, even if it's less than the full mortgage balance, they might accept it to avoid the foreclosure process. What kind of lump sum are we talking about? Patricia consulted her notes. Based on similar cases, probably somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. Significantly less than the $140,000 your parents currently owe, but still more money than you have. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right. So this plan requires me to find $60,000 to $80,000 that I don't have to buy a house I don't want, to solve a problem my parents won't let me help with. Did I miss anything? Actually, Steve said quietly, you missed the part where I loan you the money. The room went silent. I stared at my uncle, trying to process what he'd just said. Steve, no, I can't let you do that. You're not letting me do anything, I'm making a business decision. He pulled out his own folder, this one containing what looked like financial statements. I've been saving for retirement for 30 years. I have more money than I need, and I'd rather see it help my family than sit in investment accounts earning 3% interest. But what if I can't pay you back? Then you can't pay me back. Riley, you're 25 years old with a career in technology. Even if it takes you 5 years to find your footing again, you'll eventually be making good money. And even if you never pay me back completely, at least the house will be in the family instead of being sold at a sheriff's auction. I looked at Chloe, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Did you know about this when you came over here? Steve called me this morning, she admitted. He wanted someone here who could help you think through the emotional side of this decision. And what's the emotional side? The emotional side is that your parents are about to lose their home, their pride, and their financial security all at once, she said gently. And you have the power to prevent that, even if they never thank you for it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 2 years. In the apartment I probably wouldn't be able to afford much longer. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. What would happen after the settlement? I asked. I mean, if this actually worked, what would the arrangement be? Patricia flipped through her notes. Legally, you'd own the house, but you could structure the ownership however you wanted. You could let your parents continue living there as tenants, or you could transfer ownership back to them once they're in a better financial position, or you could sell the house and split the proceeds. And my parents would have to agree to this? They'd have to agree to the deed transfer, yes, but they don't have to be happy about it. Steve stood up and joined me at the window. Riley, I know this is a lot to process, and I know your parents are angry right now, but they're also scared and facing the loss of everything they've worked for. Sometimes doing the right thing means making people angry at you. They already hate me for paying their mortgage secretly. How do you think they'll react when I show up with a plan to buy their house out from under them? They'll probably be furious, he said honestly. At least at first. But the alternative is losing the house anyway, along with their credit, their savings, and their dignity. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my parents 3 weeks ago, the hurt and betrayal in their voices, the way Dad had told me to get out and never come back. The idea of approaching them with another financial solution, especially one this complicated, made my chest tight with anxiety. But I also thought about Mom sitting up all night researching foreclosure laws, and Dad working himself to exhaustion on landscaping jobs that wouldn't save the house. I thought about Marcus calling me with updates that got worse every time, and the knowledge that in a few weeks, my parents would be facing eviction from the home they'd been so proud of. How long do we have to decide? I asked. The foreclosure sale is scheduled for December 15th, Patricia said. So realistically, we'd need to approach the bank within the next 2 weeks to have time to negotiate a settlement. And my parents? The sooner we talk to them, the better. This kind of arrangement requires everyone to be on board, even if they're not thrilled about it. I turned away from the window and looked at the 3 people who'd shown up at my door with a solution I'd never considered. Steve, who was willing to risk his retirement savings on his niece's uncertain future. Patricia, who'd spent her afternoon reviewing the legal options for a family she'd never met. Chloe, who'd driven across town to make sure I didn't have to face this decision alone. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Steve said. But Riley, don't think too long. Your parents are proud people, but they're also practical. Right now, they're focused on the shame of needing help. Give them a few more weeks of facing foreclosure, and they might start focusing on solutions instead. After they left, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to imagine how the conversation with my parents would go. There was no scenario I could picture where they'd be grateful for another attempt to solve their problems. But there was also no scenario where I could live with myself if I let them lose their house when I had the power to prevent it. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Marcus's number, then put it down again. This wasn't a decision I could make based on other people's advice or expectations. It had to come from somewhere deeper than logic or family obligation. I thought about the little girl I'd been, watching my parents struggle to pay bills and keep food on the table in our cramped apartment. I thought about the day they'd gotten the keys to the house in Lakewood, the way Dad's face had lit up as he'd shown me every room. I thought about Mom planting flowers in the front yard, talking about how she'd finally had space for a real garden. That house wasn't just shelter for my parents. It wasn't even just an investment or a symbol of success. It was the physical manifestation of every sacrifice they'd made, every overtime shift Dad had worked, every coupon Mom had clipped. It was proof that their struggles had led somewhere worthwhile. And now it was about to be sold at auction to strangers who would never understand what it meant. I picked up my phone again and dialed Marcus's number. "Riley? How are you holding up? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." If there was a way to save the house, but it meant Mom and Dad would have to swallow their pride and accept help from me again, do you think they'd do it? There was a long pause. "What kind of help are we talking about?" I explained Steve's proposal, the legal implications of my mortgage payments, the possibility of a settlement with the bank. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds that indicated he was processing the information. "Jesus, Riley. That's a hell of a thing." "I know. But do you think they'd go for it?" Another pause. "Honestly, I think they're desperate enough that they might. Mom called me yesterday crying because she found boxes in the garage and realized she's going to have to start packing. Dad's been making lists of which tools he can afford to keep when they have to move into an apartment." My throat tightened. They're really going to lose everything. "Yeah, they are. And I think they're starting to realize that pride is a luxury they can't afford anymore." I closed my eyes and made the decision that would change everything. "Marcus, I need you to set up a meeting." The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at Marcus's apartment, neutral territory where emotions might run less hot than they would at my parents' house or mine. I spent Friday night rehearsing what I would say, practicing different ways to explain the legal situation without sounding condescending or manipulative. Every version seemed inadequate. Marcus lived in a modest two-bedroom place in Thornton, about halfway between my parents' house and downtown Denver. It was the kind of practical apartment that suited a single cop's lifestyle, furnished with hand-me-downs and garage sale finds that were comfortable without being impressive. When I arrived at 2 o'clock, his patrol car was already in the parking lot next to Dad's work truck. I sat in my car for 5 minutes gathering courage. Through Marcus's living room window, I could see shadows moving around, hear the low murmur of conversation. My parents were already there, already discussing whatever Marcus had told them about why this meeting was necessary. I wondered if they knew I was coming, or if Marcus had kept that detail to himself. The walk from my car to Marcus's front door felt like the longest 20 yards of my life. I knocked softly, hoping somehow that no one would answer and I could postpone this confrontation for another day. But Marcus opened the door immediately, like he'd been watching for me. "Hey," he said quietly. "They're in the living room. Fair warning, Dad's not in a great mood." "Is he ever anymore?" "Fair point." I followed him inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mom and Dad were sitting on Marcus's couch, positioned at opposite ends like they were trying to maintain as much distance as possible while still occupying the same piece of furniture. They both looked older than they had 3 weeks ago, worn down by stress and sleepless nights. Mom glanced up when I entered, her expression carefully neutral. Dad didn't look at me at all, instead focusing on his hands folded in his lap. The silence stretched out until Marcus cleared his throat. "Okay, everyone's here. Riley, you want to sit down?" I perched on the edge of Marcus's recliner, feeling like a defendant about to hear a verdict. Thank you both for coming. I know. This is awkward. Marcus said you had some kind of proposal, Dad said, still not looking at me. Something about the foreclosure. I do. But first, I want to apologize. I should have told you about the mortgage payments from the beginning. I thought I was helping, but I realize now that I was being dishonest, and I'm sorry. Mom's lips pressed together slightly, but she didn't say anything. Dad finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Apology noted. What's your proposal? I took a breath and launched into the explanation Patricia had coached me through. The legal implications of my payments, the concept of beneficial interest, the possibility of negotiating a settlement with the bank. I tried to keep it simple and factual, avoiding language that might sound like I was talking down to them. When I finished, the silence was deafening. Dad was staring at me like I'd just suggested we rob a bank together. Mom was looking between me and Marcus like she was trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Let me make sure I understand this, Dad said slowly. You're saying that because you paid our mortgage without our knowledge, you now have some kind of legal claim on our house. It's not that simple. It sounds pretty simple to me. You're saying you own part of our home. Technically, yes. And now you want us to sign the house over to you completely, so you can buy it from the bank for less than we owe. I could feel the conversation slipping away from me, the careful legal explanations getting lost in the emotional minefield of family pride and hurt feelings. Dad, the goal isn't for me to own your house. The goal is to keep you from losing it. By making us your tenants, Mom said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since I'd arrived, and her voice was flat and tired. Only temporarily. Once you're back on your feet financially, we could transfer ownership back to you, or work out some other arrangement. The important thing is stopping the foreclosure. Marcus leaned forward. Mom, Dad, you're going to lose the house anyway if you don't do something. At least this way, it stays in the family. Does it? Dad's voice was getting louder. Because it sounds to me like it becomes Riley's house, and we get to live there at her discretion. How is that different from charity? Because you'd have legal protections as tenants, I said. Though even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. And because the alternative is losing everything. Dad stood up abruptly and walked to Marcus's kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot. Do you have any idea what this feels like? First, you secretly pay our bills for 3 years, treating us like children who can't manage their own finances. Now, you want us to hand over the deed to our home so you can save us from ourselves again. That's not what this is. That's exactly what this is. He turned around, and I saw something in his face that was worse than anger. It was defeat. You're asking us to officially admit that we're failures, that we can't take care of ourselves, that we need our daughter to own our house because we're too incompetent to keep it ourselves. Frank, Mom said softly, but he was just getting started. Do you know what I told myself for 3 years when those mortgage payments kept getting made on time? I told myself that maybe I was better at managing money than I thought, that maybe the business was doing better than it seemed. I actually started to feel proud of myself for keeping us afloat. His voice cracked slightly, and I felt my chest tighten with guilt. I bragged to my brother about how we'd never missed a payment. I told the guys at the hardware store that business was good, that we were thinking about taking a vacation, all based on money that was coming from my daughter's bank account because she thought I was too pathetic to handle my own responsibilities. Dad, that's not... And now you want to make it official. You want legal documents that say, Frank, Thompson couldn't keep his house, so his daughter had to buy it for him. The room fell silent except for the tick of Marcus's kitchen clock and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just pride that was driving their resistance. It was shame so deep and pervasive that it had become part of their identity. "What if we structured it differently?" I said quietly. "What if instead of me owning the house, we set up some kind of family trust? Or what if Uncle Steve's name went on the deed instead of mine?" Mom looked up with interest for the first time. "Steve? What does Steve have to do with this?" I explained about Uncle Steve's offer to provide the settlement money, his willingness to risk his retirement savings to keep the house in the family. As I talked, I could see something shifting in my parents' expressions. Not agreement exactly, but consideration. "Steve has that kind of money?" Dad asked. "He's been saving for 30 years, and he's done well with his investments. He says he'd rather see the money help family than sit in accounts earning minimal interest." Marcus nodded. "I talked to him yesterday. He's serious about this, Dad. He's already spoken to his financial advisor about liquidating some assets." "But why would he do that?" Mom asked. "What's in it for him?" It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself. I think he remembers what it was like growing up poor. He told me once that the worst part wasn't not having money, it was feeling like you were always one crisis away from losing everything you'd worked for. Dad came back to the couch and sat down heavily. "So Steve would own the house?" "Temporarily. The idea would be to transfer it back to you once your financial situation stabilizes. Or if that takes too long, you could buy it from him at the settlement price instead of the original mortgage amount." "And what happens if we can't ever afford to buy it back?" I looked at Marcus, hoping he might have an answer I didn't. "Then at least you'd have a place to live that you could afford. Uncle Steve isn't going to throw you out on the street." The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different, less hostile, more thoughtful. I could almost see my parents processing the information, weighing their limited options against their wounded pride. "What would the monthly payments be?" Mom asked finally. "That would be up to Steve, but I'd guess significantly less than your current mortgage. Maybe $1,500 instead of $2,400. Dad's head snapped up. $1,500? We could manage $1,500. "Especially if your business picks up in the spring," Marcus added. "And if it doesn't?" Dad asked. "Then we figure something else out," I said. "But at least you wouldn't be facing foreclosure every few months." Mom stood up and walked to Marcus's kitchen, opening and closing cabinet doors like she was looking for something specific. We all watched her in silence, waiting for some indication of what she was thinking. "Barbara?" Dad said finally. She turned around, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I keep thinking about what I'm going to tell my sister when she asks where we're living, what I'm going to say when the neighbors see us packing boxes and loading a U-Haul." "You're going to tell them the truth," Dad said, "that the economy's been rough and we got behind on our mortgage." "No, I'm not." Her voice was stronger than it had been all afternoon. "I'm going to tell them that we decided to downsize because we didn't need such a big house anymore. Because that's what people do when they're being smart about their finances." She looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived. "But if we do this, if we let Steve help us, then I don't have to lie. I can tell my sister that we worked out a family arrangement, that we're renting from Steve while we save up to buy the house back." "Is that what you want to do?" I asked carefully. "What I want is to turn back time 3 years and make different decisions," she said. "But since that's not an option, I want to keep my home and my dignity, in whatever way I can manage." Dad looked at her, then at Marcus, then finally at me. "What exactly would we have to sign?" "I'd have to check with the attorney, but basically you'd be signing over the deed to Steve and he'd negotiate the settlement with the bank. Then you'd sign a lease agreement to stay in the house as tenants." "Tenants in our own home," he said bitterly. "Temporarily," I emphasized. "And Dad, it's better than being homeless." He flinched at the word, and I immediately regretted saying it. But it was true, and maybe it needed to be said. In 6 weeks, my parents would be evicted from their home regardless of how they felt about it. This arrangement would at least give them options. "How long do we have to decide?" Mom asked. "The foreclosure sale is December 15th. If we're going to do this, we need to contact the bank by the end of next week." Dad rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. "I need to think about this, and I need to talk to Steve myself. Make sure I understand what he's getting into." "Of course. He's expecting your call." Marcus stood up. "Why don't we all take a few days to process this? Riley, you can work with the attorney to get all the paperwork ready, just in case. Mom, Dad, you can talk to Steve and figure out if this feels right to you." As we were getting ready to leave, Mom approached me in the hallway. "Riley, I need you to understand something. If we do this, it doesn't mean everything is forgiven and forgotten. You still lied to us for 3 years. You still made major decisions about our lives without including us." "I know, Mom. I'm not expecting this to fix our relationship overnight." "Good, because it won't. But I also need you to know that I understand why you did what you did. And even though I'm angry about how you did it, I'm grateful that you cared enough to try to help. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was the first indication I'd had that maybe, eventually, we might find our way back to being a family again." 3 days later, Marcus called to tell me that Dad had spent 2 hours on the phone with Uncle Steve, going over every detail of the arrangement. Steve had been patient and transparent, sharing his financial statements and explaining exactly how the settlement process would work. "Dad's still not happy about it," Marcus said, "but he's realistic. Mom found an apartment complex they could afford if they lose the house, and she said it was the most depressing place she'd ever seen. Tiny units, no yard, neighbors who looked like they'd given up on life." "So they're going to do it?" "They're going to meet with Steve and the attorney tomorrow. If everything looks legitimate and they can live with the terms, they'll sign." The papers. I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. What if it doesn't work? What if the bank won't accept the settlement? Then we're no worse off than we are now. But Riley, Patricia seems confident that it'll work. Banks are motivated to avoid foreclosure costs, especially in cases where the borrower is cooperative. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways this plan could backfire and make everything worse. But I also thought about the alternative, about my parents packing their belongings into boxes and leaving the home they'd worked so hard to buy. The next evening, Uncle Steve called me directly. "We're doing this," he said without preamble. "Your parents signed all the paperwork, and Patricia is going to contact the bank first thing Monday morning." "How did they seem?" "Resigned, mostly. Your dad kept asking if I was sure about the financial risk, and your mom wanted to know if there were any hidden clauses that would let me kick them out. But they both understand that this is their best option." "Steve, I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to thank me, Riley. This is what family does. We help each other, even when it's complicated and messy and nobody's completely happy about it." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment and tried to imagine what the next few months would look like. If the settlement worked, my parents would still be living in their house, but under completely different circumstances. They'd be tenants, instead of homeowners, dependent on Steve's generosity instead of their own financial success. It wasn't the ending any of us had wanted, but it was better than the alternative. And maybe, eventually, it would lead to something better than any of us could imagine right now. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with news that made my hands shake as I answered the phone. "The bank accepted the settlement offer," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. $68,000, and they'll release the lien on the property. Steve can take ownership as soon as the funds transfer. I sank into my kitchen chair, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. It actually worked. It actually worked. Your parents get to keep their home, Steve gets a rental property that'll probably appreciate in value, and you get your family back eventually. What's next? Steve will officially own the house as of December 1st. Your parents' lease begins the same day at $1,500 a month with an option to purchase at the settlement price within 5 years. After Patricia and I hung up, I called Marcus with the news. He whooped so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I can't believe it worked," he said. "Mom's going to cry. Good tears this time. Have you talked to them about me lately? About whether they might be ready to have a conversation?" "Actually, yeah. Dad asked me yesterday if you'd found a new job yet. When I told him you were still looking, he got that look he gets when he's thinking about something complicated." "What kind of look?" "The kind that usually means he's about to do something that surprises everyone." That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized, but hadn't seen on my screen in over a month. Dad's cell phone. "Riley." His voice was gruff, but not hostile. "Marcus tells me the bank accepted the settlement." "Yes, it all went through this morning. You get to keep the house." There was a long pause. "I guess I owe you a thank you." "Dad, you don't owe me anything. I'm just glad it worked out." "Riley, I've been thinking about what you said, about families helping each other. And I've been thinking about the last 3 years, about how I felt when I thought we were managing on our own." I held my breath, not sure where this was going. "The truth is, we weren't managing. We were drowning, and too proud to admit it. If you hadn't helped, we would have lost the house 3 years ago, and we would have been too embarrassed to ask anyone for help. I should have told you what I was doing." "Yes, you should have. But I should have swallowed my pride and asked for help instead of pretending everything was fine. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, I felt like maybe everything was going to be okay." 6 months after the settlement, I was standing in my parents' kitchen on a Saturday morning in May, helping Mom prep vegetables for a family barbecue. It was the first time I'd been invited to one of their gatherings since the whole mortgage situation had exploded, and the normalcy of chopping onions and discussing marinade recipes felt almost surreal. "Hand me that bowl," Mom said, pointing to a ceramic dish on the counter. "I want to get the potato salad started before people arrive." People meant Marcus and his new girlfriend Sarah, Uncle Steve and his wife Linda, and surprisingly, 3 of Dad's landscaping clients who had become family friends over the years. The guest list was evidence of how much had changed since December. My parents were no longer hiding from their social circle, no longer afraid that people would discover their financial struggles. "Riley," Dad called from the backyard where he was setting up tables and chairs. "Can you grab me another extension cord from the garage? I want to move the speakers closer to the deck." I found the extension cord buried behind paint cans and gardening supplies, marveling at how organized the garage had become. Dad had spent the winter months reorganizing his tools and equipment, turning the space into an efficient workshop that served both his landscaping business and his new hobby of building furniture for the house. The house itself looked better than it had in years. With the pressure of impossible mortgage payments removed, my parents had been able to invest in small improvements and repairs. Fresh paint in the living room, new curtains in the bedrooms, a vegetable garden that Mom had planted along the back fence. It was still the same house, but it felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from its foundation. "Dad seems happy," I said to Mom as I came back through the kitchen. "He is. We both are, in ways we didn't expect." She looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. "It took us a while to adjust to the idea of renting instead of owning, but there's something freeing about not worrying that every unexpected expense might cost us our home." I nodded, understanding what she meant. The lease agreement with Uncle Steve was generous and flexible, with built-in protections that gave my parents security without the crushing financial pressure they'd lived under for years. Steve had structured the rent to be affordable even during Dad's slower winter months, And he'd included provisions for maintenance and improvements that treated my parents more like partners than tenants. "Have you and Dad talked any more about buying the house back?" I asked. Mom smiled, but it was complicated. "We've talked about it. Steve says the option is there whenever we're ready, but honestly, I'm not sure we want to go back to owning." The responsibility was heavier than we realized. It was a conversation we'd had several times over the past few months, and it always surprised me how much my parents' perspective on home ownership had changed. The house that had once represented achievement and stability now represented something different, a place where they could build a life without the constant fear of losing everything. The doorbell rang, and I could hear Marcus's voice in the front hallway, followed by laughter and the sound of multiple conversations starting at once. Through the kitchen window, I watched Uncle Steve setting up a card table on the deck, his movements careful and deliberate in the way that suggested he was truly at home here. Steve's relationship with my parents had evolved into something that surprised all of us. What had started as a financial rescue had become a genuine friendship, with Steve stopping by regularly to check on maintenance issues and staying for dinner more often than not. He'd become the wise older brother my dad had never had, offering advice on business decisions and listening patiently to Mom's concerns about everything from the economy to Marcus's career choices. "Riley, there you are," Steve said as I joined the group on the deck. "I was just telling your dad about a potential client I met this week. Big commercial property that needs landscaping work. Might be perfect for Thompson Landscaping." Dad's face lit up with interest. His business had grown significantly over the past 6 months, partly because he was no longer distracted by financial panic, and partly because word had spread about the quality of his work. He'd hired 2 part-time employees and was considering expanding into lawn maintenance contracts with several office complexes. "What kind of timeline are they working with?" Dad asked, pulling out his phone to make notes. As Steve and Dad discussed the details, I found myself watching their interaction with fascination. 6 months ago, Dad would have been suspicious of help from anyone, convinced that accepting assistance was an admission of failure. Now he was actively collaborating with Steve on business opportunities, treating him like a trusted advisor rather than a reluctant benefactor. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward moments, tense conversations about rent payments and household decisions, and more than one argument about independence versus interdependence. But gradually, my parents had discovered that accepting help didn't mean giving up control, and Steve had learned that helping family meant more than just writing checks. "Riley," Sarah said, approaching with a plate of appetizers. "Marcus told me you got a new job. Congratulations." "Thanks, it's been a good fit." The job was at a mid-sized software company downtown, developing accessibility tools for people with disabilities. The work was meaningful, the pay was decent, and the company culture reminded me of my old startup without the financial instability. I'd been there for 3 months and was already being considered for a promotion. "Are you still living in Capitol Hill?" she asked. "Actually, I just signed a lease on a place in Lakewood, closer to family." It was a small apartment about 10 minutes from my parents' house. Nothing fancy, but comfortable and affordable. The decision to move closer hadn't been about keeping an eye on my parents, but about rebuilding the relationship that had been strained by years of secrets and misunderstandings. Marcus appeared at my elbow, grinning. "Tell her about your side project." I rolled my eyes. "It's not that exciting." "What side project?" Sarah asked. "I've been doing some freelance work for small nonprofits, helping them improve their websites and online fundraising systems. It's just a few hours a week, but it's been rewarding." What I didn't mention was that the freelance work had been Uncle Steve's idea. He'd connected me with several organizations he supported, suggesting that my technical skills could make a real difference for groups that couldn't afford professional web development services. The work didn't pay much, but it had given me a sense of purpose that went beyond my day job. "Riley's being modest," Steve said, overhearing our conversation. She redesigned the website for the Colorado Food Bank, and their online donations increased by 40% in the first month. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and it struck me how much our family dynamics had shifted. Steve wasn't just helping with financial problems anymore. He was actively invested in everyone's success and happiness. He celebrated Dad's business wins, supported Mom's interest in returning to college, and encouraged my career development like the mentor I'd never known I needed. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself in conversation with Tom and Maria, two of Dad's longtime clients who had become close family friends. They were a retired couple who'd hired Dad to landscape their backyard 5 years ago and had been so impressed with his work that they'd recommended him to dozens of other people. "Your father's a different man than he was a year ago," Tom said, watching Dad explain proper pruning techniques to Marcus. "More relaxed, more confident. Whatever you all did to resolve those financial troubles, it was the right call." I glanced at Mom, who was listening to our conversation while arranging flowers in a vase. We'd never told Tom and Maria the full story of the mortgage situation, but they'd obviously noticed the change in my parents' demeanor and lifestyle. "Sometimes families have to get creative about helping each other," Mom said diplomatically. "We're fortunate to have options most people don't have." It was a graceful way to acknowledge Steve's help without going into details, and I was struck by how comfortable Mom had become discussing their situation. 6 months ago, she would have changed the subject or made excuses. Now she could talk about family support without shame or defensiveness. "The important thing is that it worked out," Maria said. "You have a beautiful home, Frank's business is thriving, and you all seem genuinely happy. That's what matters." After Tom and Maria went home, the family lingered on the deck as the sun began to set. Steve and Linda were playing cards with Marcus and Sarah, their laughter carrying across the yard. Mom was reading a magazine in the porch swing Dad had built for her birthday. Dad was tinkering with his speakers, trying to get the perfect sound quality for background music. I sat in a lawn chair, watching the scene, and trying to remember the last time our family had felt this peaceful. Not just content, but genuinely at ease with each other and with their circumstances. "Penny for your thoughts," Dad said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Just thinking about how different everything is now." He nodded, understanding what I meant without needing elaboration. "Better different, I think." "Definitely better different." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the sound of conversation and laughter from the card table. Finally, Dad spoke again. "Riley, I need to tell you something I probably should have said months ago." I turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on his face. I spent a lot of years being angry about things I couldn't control. The economy, the competition, the fact that landscaping work is seasonal and unpredictable. I was so focused on proving that I could handle everything on my own that I forgot the most important thing. Which was? That family isn't about proving you don't need help. It's about being there when help is needed and accepting it when it's offered. His words hung in the evening air, carrying weight that went far beyond the immediate conversation. You offered help, and instead of being grateful, I got defensive and angry. I made it about my pride instead of about our family's well-being. "Dad, you were protecting your dignity. I understand that. Maybe, but dignity isn't worth much if you lose everything else in the process." He gestured toward the house, the yard, the gathering of people who cared about us. "This is worth more than my ego." I felt tears starting to form and blinked them back. "I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I should have treated you like an adult who could make his own decisions about accepting help. And I should have been adult enough to ask for help when I needed it, instead of pretending everything was fine." It wasn't the first time we'd had this conversation, but it felt different somehow. More final, like we were putting something to rest rather than just discussing it. "The thing is," Dad continued, "I realize now that you weren't trying to control us, or make us feel incompetent. You were trying to protect us. And even though you went about it the wrong way, your heart was in the right place. I love you, Dad. Both of you. I couldn't stand watching you struggle when I had the means to help. I know. And I love you too, kiddo. More than my pride, more than my ego, more than my need to feel like I'm in control of everything. The sun was fully set now, and Mom had turned on the porch lights. Steve was shuffling cards for another round of whatever game they were playing, and Marcus was laughing at something Sarah had said. It was the kind of ordinary family evening that I'd taken for granted before everything fell apart, and that felt precious now that we'd fought so hard to rebuild it. Dad, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you happy? I mean, really happy? Not just relieved that the foreclosure is over, but genuinely content with how things worked out. He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. You know, I think I am. It took me a while to get there, and there are still moments when I wish things had worked out differently. But yeah, I'm happy. What changed? I guess I realized that happiness isn't about owning the perfect house or running the most successful business or never needing help from anyone. It's about having people in your life who care enough to help when you need it, and being secure enough to accept that help when it's offered. He looked around at the gathering, at Steve dealing cards and Mom reading contentedly in her swing, and Marcus teaching Sarah the rules of whatever game they were about to play. This isn't the life I planned when I was younger, but it's a good life. Maybe better than what I planned because it's based on reality instead of fantasy. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, I sat in my car in my parents' driveway and called Chloe. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "Really well, better than I expected. It feels like we're actually a family again, not just people who happen to be related." "I'm so glad, Riley. You've all been through hell this past year." "Yeah, but I think we're stronger now. More honest with each other, at least." "And how are you doing?" "Really?" "Doing?" I thought about the question, taking inventory of my life in a way I hadn't done in months. "I'm good. The new job is working out. I like living closer to family, and I feel like I'm finally doing work that matters. Not just the day job, but the nonprofit stuff too." "Any regrets about how everything played out?" "Some. I wish I'd handled the mortgage situation differently from the beginning. I wish it hadn't taken a crisis to force us all to be honest with each other. But overall, no. I think we all learned things we needed to learn. Such as that help isn't the same as charity, that families can be complicated and messy and still functional, that sometimes the best solution isn't the one anyone originally wanted. After we hung up, I sat in the car for a few more minutes looking at my parents' house. The porch light was still on, and I could see Dad in the living room, probably watching the late news. Mom was likely already in bed, reading one of the romance novels she'd gotten back into since her stress levels had decreased. Tomorrow, Dad would get up early and head out to job sites around the city, building the landscaping business that was finally thriving. Mom would work in her garden and maybe drive to the community college to pick up information about the horticulture program she was considering enrolling in. Steve would probably stop by in the afternoon to check on some minor repair project and end up staying for dinner. It was ordinary life, the kind of stable, peaceful existence that my parents had been chasing for years without realizing it. Not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded in honesty and mutual support, rather than pride and denial. As I drove home to my own apartment, I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, so convinced that I could solve my family's problems by throwing money at them. I'd been right about the money part, but wrong about almost everything else. The real solution hadn't been financial, it had been emotional. It had required all of us to let go of the stories we'd been telling ourselves about independence and success and family roles. The foreclosure notice had been the crisis that forced us to confront reality, But the real transformation had happened in the months that followed, as we learned how to be honest with each other about our limitations and our needs. We'd discovered that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, and that offering help wasn't about superiority or control. Most importantly, we'd learned that family isn't about never needing each other. It's about being there when the need arises and trusting that love is stronger than pride. 6 months later, I still didn't regret the choice I'd made to help my parents, even though it had cost me almost everything I'd saved and had nearly destroyed our relationship in the process. Because in the end, we'd all gained something more valuable than financial security or home ownership or individual success. We'd gained each other back, and this time it was built on truth instead of secrets, on collaboration instead of pride, and on love that was strong enough to survive even the messiest complications of being human. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.